Hey everybody, this is Ryan McClanahan with historythroughcards.com. Hope you're all doing very well today. So while I was doing research on my article for the 1933 Gaudy set, I looked into Babe Ruth, and he's got four cards in this set because he's the spokesman for the company and the product, Gaudy Gum. And so when I was looking specifically at Babe Ruth's last years from 1932 to 1935, and then I narrowed it down a little bit more between 1934 and specifically 1935. And I was really interested in his time with the Boston Braves. And I started to notice that there are some really interesting connections here between Babe Ruth's time on the Braves and the plot line for the movie The Natural with Robert Redford from 1984. And if you guys haven't seen this movie yet, go and watch it and then come back because I'm going to actually have a few spoilers here. There's actually a real heavy connection here between, or you can connect the dots, I should say, between Babe Ruth and Charles Adams of the Boston Bruins and Suffolk Downs, the racetrack here in Boston. And at first, I was like, wait a minute, how is there connections here between all three? They're completely different. But what I like about Bernard Malamut's book, The Natural, which came out in 1952, he was a big fan of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And what he did was his first book. And what he did was that he actually took actual events and wove them into his book in such a way that it may seem like just something that he came up with. However, there's a lot of little details in the movie The Natural, which I actually like a lot better than the book. But there are a lot of details here that were taken from actual events. In the movie, you have an instance where Roy Hobbs, one of the main characters in the movie, hits a home run into the clock at Wrigley Field. So this actually did take place on May 30th, 1946, in a Braves Dodgers game at Ebbets Field, and it was Bama Rowell who hit the Bolivia clock at Ebbets Field, and the glass actually rained down on Dixie Walker, and so that actually did take place. And the funny thing is that Bolivia had said that if anybody can hit a ball off of the clock, they'll get a free watch. And actually, Bama had to wait until like the 1970s to get that free watch. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. But that actually is one of the many cases that remains actual in the book and the movie. It's just changed in a way that makes it look like Bernard Malamute just came up with it on the fly, and so that's one of the beauties of his writing. He actually has a few other books out there, but his biggest one is The Natural. I don't like the book too much, honestly. I like the movie a lot better, particularly because Robert Redford is such a great actor, and he makes the movie. He really does, and he's actually in a lot of other great movies too. Sneakers is one, and 3 Days the Condor, another one. He's got so many great movies. However, with this one though, I made a very interesting connection between Babe Ruth signing a contract with the Boston Braves in 1935 and Charles Adams, the owner of the Boston Bruins, and Suffolk Downs, the racetrack. And you're probably like, wait, what? How is there any connection to this? That's the first thing I thought too, and so I started to do a little bit of research, and then I remembered when I watched the movie, and I actually rewatched it afterwards as well. I think Babe Ruth's signing with the Braves had some really interesting consequences going forward, not just for the Braves, but for baseball, and something that we may actually be facing today too with gambling. And so I'm I'm going to give you a little bit of the behind the scenes of one of the major plot lines in the movie and tell you actually what occurred. So there's a specific scene in the movie where Roy Hobbs is at a party thrown by his girlfriend Memo Paris, and I guess they're supposed to get married or something like that. So during the party, he has a lot of stomach issues, a lot of pains, and he goes down. And the next he knows, he's in a hospital. The doctor comes by and fishes out a silver bullet that was lodged in his stomach or in his side. Now, how you go like 2 decades or so with like a silver bullet in you, I don't know, and no problems. Anyway, that aside, the judge walks in, the owner of the New York Knights, who are actually supposed to be the New York Giants. And so, for whatever reason, they couldn't use the New York Giants logo or something like that, but they kind of, very similar to that. So that's what they're supposed to be. Roy Hobbs already knows what's going down, and he's has a pile of cash thrown his way and some photos and this girl who shot him years ago. And that's another issue that I'm going to deal with in another video. The judge says to him, well, they lost three in a row without you, so you better take this money. And Roy Hobbs is like, no, I'm not going to participate in this. I don't want your money. And so it actually came down to a one game playoff with the Pittsburgh Pirates. And what I like about that scene is that the coach or the manager of the Pirates is actually Sibby Sisti of the Boston Braves. He played back in the late 1930s and 40s and early 50s. And he was the technical advisor on The Natural. And so I really like that. I thought that was a really nice touch to bring him on board like that. All right, so also in the movie too, Pop Fisher, who's the manager of the New York Knights, if he can gain control of the stock, he can buy out the judge, and the judge has to step down. And this is going to be really important going forward when you listen to these articles. And we'll pick it up on the other side of this. This is from the Harrisburg Telegraph, February 6, 1935. National League to help Boston Braves. Emil Fuchs is happy. With their financial difficulties apparently well on the way to settlement, Emil E. Fuchs firmly entrenched as president, and Bill McKechnie definitely assured the job as manager. The Boston Braves were in a position today to make plans for the 1935 pennant race in the National League. The club's tangled affairs were raveled to a great extent yesterday when the National League signed the renewal of the lease on Braves Field for the next 11 years, thus eliminating any possibility that dog racing or any other conflicting activity would invade the park before 1946. The lease, said to have been made at a substantial saving, then was turned over to the Boston club. Fuchs, who was given a vote of confidence by the league owners, announced that, quote, substantial progress, unquote, had been made in straightening out the Braves' financial situation, and that he hoped to have all of the club's outstanding indebtedness settled within the next 2 weeks. He also disclosed that the advance sale of tickets already had netted $43,000, of which $10,000 was cash in hand. From Fuchs came the assurance that McKechnie, manager of the Braves for the last 5 years, again would be at the helm. As to the possibility of Babe Ruth being sought in some capacity, he declined to comment. Quote, all I can say about that is McKechnie will be manager, said Fuchs. I hope to have McKechnie in charge of the team as long as I am in control of the club. Fuchs revealed for the first time that much of the club's difficulties of the last few months could have been eliminated had the Braves listened to the tempting offers of Ed Lefty Brandt and Wally Berger, hard-hitting outfielder. But we simply would not do that, he said, because The fans of Boston always have supported us loyally, and we decided we would not let them down like that, no matter what happened. We are keeping all of our best players, and we will strive to add strength if that can be done in deals. This is from the Knoxville Journal, Knoxville, Tennessee, June 4th, 1935. Bambino turns loose, bitter verbal lashing on Emil Fuchs by Jack Cuddy. Babe Ruth completed a home run from Boston tonight, bellowing like a banderolled bull over the alleged knavery of one Judge Emil Fuchs, whose double-crossing, double-dealing, and double-eyed lying caused me to leave the Braves. The great Bambino, who beat President Fuchs of the Braves to the punch yesterday by quitting the club before Fuchs could kick him out, leaped from his tan sedan, hurried into his 88th Street apartment, tore off his coat, and gave a gang of baseball writers, quote, "my final statement against Fuchs," unquote, the most surreptitious blast of invectives ever exploded by a slugger in his long career. Ruth said he quit the Braves because 1. Fuchs found out that he couldn't pay my $25,000 a year salary. Instead of coming to me like a man and explaining the situation, he tried to discredit me and case me out. If he had acted like a white man, what the fuck? If he acted like a white man, I would have quit without any trouble. 2. Fuchs thought I would invest my money in the Braves, or at least talk my friends into investing their money, and when I persistently ignored his hints on his subject, I was no longer welcome. 3. Fuchs thought he could use me as a glorified night out salesman for his tickets. Me, a 41-year-old guy who had to take marvelous care of himself to play ball at all, and when I refused to be a glorified salesman, he was through with me. That's the way Ruth crystallized his difficulties during 2 mad months with the Braves. Those were the chief reasons he gave as he squirmed about in Eyrie over an easy chair, tramped about the living room floor of his apartment, pounding his fists, or leaning into the radio, glaring at the sports reporters. His whole story of the Boston fiasco lasted nearly 45 minutes. Quote, "I'm sore about the whole Boston affair," the Babe growled through clenched teeth as he stood in the center of the room. "But what burns me to a crisp is Fuchs' attempt to blacken my name, discredit me, and make it look as if manager Bill McKechnie was the one who wanted me fired." He then roared, "But Fuchs won't get away with it. He can't make a foul ball out of me after all my years in the game. I'll match my baseball record with his any day." Ruth, his wife Claire, daughter Dorothy, and mother-in-law left Boston at 10:30 a.m. today, and they arrived at the Ruth apartment at 5:25 p.m. The BAM drove the entire 225 miles with only one halt for lunch at, geez, I can't remember the name of the town, but it was a lousy lunch. Claire said they had lunched at Stafford Springs, Connecticut. Once rid of his blue serge cap and his apartment, Ruth said to the reporters, "I'm glad you fellows are here. I hate this business, and I want to finish it right now. It's bad for baseball. So I'll make my final statement, tell you the whole story, and that'll be the end of it, regardless of what Fuchs says, and he'll say plenty." Blue-shirted Babe emphasized that he would not even make a final statement were it not for Fuchs' lies in Boston, to the effect that his drinking escapades, disobedience, and general conduct had made it impossible for McKechnie to run the club, and he had caused the Braves to slump in last place. "All that stuff is lies," Ruth declared. "McKechnie and I never had any trouble or argument. We were pals. We got along fine. Proof of this is Bill's own words, no later than 10:30 this morning. He came down to the hotel just as we were about to drive to New York. He told me right there at my own auto that he never had asked Fuchs to discharge me or complained to him in any way. He shook my hand and wished me the best of luck. We were pals, and we parted as pals. McKechnie is a square guy. I know he wouldn't tell me one thing to my face and then pop off behind my back. I never heard him tell other players what he thought of them. He isn't a double crosser like Fuchs. But Fuchs, who would double cross a hot cross bun, is picking out Mac for the fall guy, the guy to be made responsible for my leaving the club. He won't take the blame on his own shoulders. Would Fuchs double cross McKechnie? Say, listen, do you think Bill knew that my civil contract with Fuchs called for me to become manager and positively next year? No, Bill didn't know about it. Neither did Charles Adams, who holds most of the club's stock. I thought they both knew about it when I popped off in New York that time. Ruth's announcement shortly after signing with the Braves that he would be manager in 1936 was his first run-in with Fuchs. He said everything went along swell until after the training trip when Fuchs wanted the Babe to autograph $500 worth of tickets, which the owner of a clothing store had promised to buy on that condition. Did you ever autograph $500 worth of tickets? Well, try it sometime. I was hired to play baseball, not to be a stenographer. So I told Fuchs that wasn't in my line and for him to mind his own business and I would just mind mine. Just before the club went west, the next incident occurred. It was May 12th and the Braves were playing the Cubs. Quote, I felt in such bad shape that I decided to quit. I called Fuchs and McKechnie into the clubhouse and told them. Fuchs almost cried. He said if I quit he might as well quit too. I felt sorry for him, and I knew his financial condition, so I said I would stick. Well, when we got to Pittsburgh and I knocked those 3 home runs, I felt like a chicken again. I thought everything would be okay, but in Cincinnati, I pulled something in my left knee, but I tried to play anyway in Philadelphia. In the first game, chasing a fly, I knew I was through for a while. Then Fuchs started reports that I was dogging it. No, Mr. Ruth had no immediate plans for the future. He hoped to remain in baseball, might even try to play 2 or 3 times a week with a club. Yes, he would return to Boston if Fuchs severed his connection with the club. This is another section of the newspaper. It's from Bill King. It states, while his right hand was still tingling from Babe Ruth's hearty farewell handshake, Bill McKechnie, manager of the sorely beset Boston Braves, today banded the newly retired home run slugger as a detriment to his ball club. McKechnie, who had little to say about the Babe during the 97 days he served under his managership, hastened into a conference with President Emil Fuchs after seeing Ruth and his family leave by automobile for New York. The pilot and financially harassed Superior spent most of the afternoon discussing ways and means for the immediate strengthening of their last place baseball forces, and when they adjourned their session, a long statement blasting Ruth's record as a Brave was issued over McKechnie's signature. Quote, I must state publicly that in justice to the action of Judge Fuchs with reference to Babe Ruth, on Friday and Saturday of last week, I pointed out to Judge Fuchs that the main trouble with the ball club was that it was not able to function properly with Babe Ruth playing in the outfield, was McKechnie's opening paragraph. I must state publicly that in justice to the action of Judge Fuchs with reference to Babe Ruth, on Friday and Saturday of last week, I pointed out to Judge Fuchs that the main trouble with the ball club was that it was not able to function properly with Babe Ruth playing in the outfield, was McKechnie's opening paragraph. Quote, I frankly stated that certain actions of Ruth while with the ball club, which I would absolutely forbid with any other member of the club, were responsible for the lack of discipline, and that unless Judge Fuchs could convince Ruth to retire, I was unable to get any real baseball discipline or proper spirit as manifested by the club previous to the acquisition of Ruth. The pitching staff complained continuously to the end that Judge Fuchs promised me that he would have a talk with Ruth and endeavor to show him the impossibility of the situation, that if Ruth could not join in the spirit of these suggestions, which were for the benefit as well as the decorum of the club, he would ask Ruth, in order to preserve his reputation, to retire, and he would make his parting as a commendable and pleasant as possible. Fuchs was patient. Quote, I know that Judge Fuchs has been patient and has endeavored to give Ruth every opportunity to continue with the hope of improving. I regret the unfortunate termination of Ruth's connection with the club, but in order to be fair, I must state that Judge Fuchs' action was the result of my stating that the ball club, as constituted, with a little help and necessary with the elimination of Ruth, would again function in full efficiency and regain the standing it has enjoyed for the past several years. While McKechnie was citing his version of the baseball tragedy, his club was en route to Haverhill, where, to the keen disappointment of the Kiwanis Club of that shoe manufacturing city, it defeated the Pawtucket Industrial League All-Stars 9-4 before a slim crowd of 2,000. The clubmen arranged this game last March, feeling assured that Ruth's presence in such a game would attract a huge gathering and provide a large sum for their pet charities. The babe was incredulous when told McKechnie had charged him with undermining the discipline of the club. At first he refused to believe McKechnie said it, pointing out that he had parted on the best of terms with the pilot of the Braves. In fact, the babe had waxed eloquent in his defense of McKechnie. Then he was read the manager's statement. Quote, there's no basis for that at all, he roared. How could he say a thing like that? Anyway, I'm all washed up with the outfit, and I'm not going to carry on any more arguments. Nonetheless, this took some of the wind out of Ruth's previous statement in response to a question that he would be glad to return to Boston as manager of the Braves if Fuchs stepped out. So I think this is really interesting because Babe Ruth's contract with the Braves, it only took place because James Michael Curley, who was the governor of Massachusetts at the time, he actually did a stint in prison while he was, I believe, governor. He's also the mayor too. Anyway, different story altogether, but I think it's kind of fascinating. However, James Michael Curley stated to Fuchs that, Ruth's contract with the Yankees is just about up, and you might want to go and try to grab the guy. And Fuchs was really in debt at the time because it's the Great Depression, and the club actually had to lower their ticket sales as well to gain more fans into the field. So, what I thought was also interesting too is a little behind the scenes here that Braves Field was not actually owned by the Braves. It was owned by the estate of James Gaffney, who was the former owner of the Braves back in 1912. When Gaffney had actually purchased the Braves, his minority owner at the time was John Montgomery Ward, and it was John Montgomery Ward who came up with the name Boston Braves, and the Brave itself is a symbol of Tammany Hall, and there's a lot of New York connections between Tammany Hall and the ownership of the Braves, and even with the Red Sox at one point in time too. However, and you're going to see going forward too that there's another connection here with the Red Sox and the Braves through ownership. Fuchs was heavily in debt by 1932, and so he was buying players that he couldn't afford, and I believe that he spent over $300,000 on players that he was borrowing money from, and he didn't have the finances necessary to buy these players. Where he got the money from, I'm not entirely sure. But one of the players that he had bought, knowing that he didn't have money, was Wally Berger. And Wally Berger was a really great ball player. And if he had actually played for like the Yankees or maybe another team, he probably would be in the Hall of Fame right now. He's a 300 lifetime batter and just a really fantastic ball player. There were other really great ball players on the Braves, but they really couldn't stack up. And because the team itself was just so mismanaged, one question kind of remained, well, how did Emil Fuchs actually end up being the owner of the Braves? And this actually goes back to the New York Giants in 1923. So Christy Mathewson had actually been gassed in a training accident along with Ty Cobb and Branch Rickey and a few other people as well. And so he had tuberculosis from that, and that's something that's really interesting in its own right. However, by 1923, though, Mathewson was so sick that he really couldn't perform the day-to-day activities, so he stepped down, and he ended up passing away in 1925, and that left his minority owner, who was Judge Emil Fuchs, to actually own the team. And Fuchs was actually in baseball prior to this. He was the attorney for John McGraw in the New York Giants. So that's his connection to baseball at first. And then he's also a New York guy as well. So he's got an ownership stake in a Boston team, which really wasn't cool with a lot of the fans, to tell you the truth. They didn't like this at all. They didn't like all the New York connections to their ball clubs. And so they really wanted a New England guy to head up the club. And actually, that's what happened further down the line here. Bob Quinn actually ended up taking control of the Braves. He was actually the owner of the Red Sox from 1923 to 1932, and then he sold the Red Sox to Tom Yawkey. And as you'll find out in the next section here that I'm going to read, this is really interesting because this is the connection between Charles Adams and the Suffolk Downs. And so Charles Adams had 65% of the ownership in the Braves. So he was able to oust Emil Fuchs out of his position. That was a very real possibility that the team was going to go to Baltimore. And actually, it wasn't the only team that was going to move at the time, too. 1941, the St. Louis Browns were going to move to California and I think Los Angeles, and the only thing that prevented them from doing so was Pearl Harbor. However, in this case, though, as you'll find out, there's some really interesting things that are happening that's preventing Charles Adams from becoming a owner of the Braves further, and you're going to see what that is. This is from the Boston Globe, December 21st, 1935. Financial statement of Braves submitted by James C. O'Leary. A special meeting of the old stockholders of the Boston National League Club has been called to be held at the Braves Winter Office, Copley Plaza Hotel, Tuesday, December 31st at 11 o'clock a.m. The Boston Club, through default of obligations, surrendered its franchise and players' contracts, particularly its only assets, to the National League November 26 last. At that time, the club had liabilities in excess of its appraised assets of $316,176.99. It is proposed at the special meeting to authorize the liquidation and dissolution of the old company and confirm the action of the National League in expelling it from membership in the National League. Accompanying the notice to the stockholders, which was given out last evening, at the Milk Street office of Charles F. Adams was a financial statement by Mr. Adams as vice president and also a statement by Bob Quinn, who has been awarded the Boston franchise by the National League. Mr. Quinn informs the stockholders in the old club that they may, if they so desire, subscribe for stock in the new club on the same basis that he himself is buying it, but that he does not intend to make any public offering of the stock, as with the assurance that he has of financial support the club will need no additional stock subscription. He is giving the old stockholders an opportunity to come in, which he believes they also are entitled to, but if they do not wish to do so, it will be all right so far as he is concerned. In his letter, he states, among other things, I have made arrangements with the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs for the Boston franchise and have satisfied all of the requirements of the National League with respect hereto. According to my understanding with the National League, the following conditions are to be met. 1. That satisfactory provision be made for the payment of all such debts and obligations to your company and as are known and admitted by your company. 2. That the franchise be issued to a Massachusetts corporation adequately financed to operate a ball club in the National League. 3. That in the first instance I should be the controlling stockholder in the new organization. 4. That the new club be assured of the use of the Boston ballpark of adequate capacity. And 5. That so long as Mr. Charles F. Adams has a substantial stock interest in and as an officer of the Eastern Racing Association, Inc., he should not be an officer of the new baseball club or a stockholder therein. This last condition is imposed out of consideration of the views of Judge Landis regarding any interconnection between baseball and racing, and Mr. Adams desires to respect this position. So eventually, what happened was that Suffolk Downs was built in 1935, and Charles Adams was one of the main facilitators of the building itself of the racetrack. Now, there's a huge problem here that Judge Landis and Ford Frick had, and that's because you really can't have an owner of a baseball club also be the owner of a racetrack because of the 1919 World Series scandal. And there are a lot of cases outside of the 1919 World Series scandal where betting was influenced by horse racing through parimutuel betting. And once that was shut off, the gamblers decided to go over to baseball, and this really hurt baseball pretty badly throughout the 1910s and into the early 1920s. And we have instances where there were several World Series that may have been fixed to certain extents. I know that there is a little bit of evidence to suggest that the 1918 World Series was fixed. I'm not entirely convinced of that, but from what I've heard, the Cubs had thrown the 1918 World Series, and they were actually on board the same train that some of the White Sox guys were on. And again, I'm not entirely sure. There's no real direct evidence to pinpoint to that. But then you have the 1914 World Series, and the Philadelphia Athletics supposedly dumped that, according to Connie Mack himself. And Connie Mack was so convinced that his players had thrown the 1914 World Series that he traded the majority of them and just started over again. And that actually kind of makes a little bit of sense, more so than the 1918 World Series. But then you have the 1912 World Series where there was a scandal involving gate receipts. And gate receipts were something that Babe Ruth really wanted when he signed a contract with the Boston Braves. He wanted a portion of that because it was worth more than his signature, I guess, or how much money he was making. And in 1935, Ruth was actually up for a 3-year contract, in which he was to be paid $25,000 per year. That's the equivalent in 2023 of $557,839.30. It's quite a chunk of change, even in 1935. But that's actually kind of a pittance to what Babe Ruth was making in 1932 as the highest paid ball player in the United States. He was actually making more money than President Hoover, and in which Ruth had said that he had a better year than Hoover, which is actually true. And Hoover lost the presidency to FDR. So I thought this was really interesting. The other thing too is that there is something to what Ruth was saying that Fuchs had kind of sullied his name, and I think he may have been aware of something that happened back in like 1928. It was through Charles Adams uh, that the club had gotten Rogers Hornsby, and Hornsby signed a contract with the Braves in January of 1928, and he was to have again a 3-year contract with the club. But what happened was that something had happened. Hornsby was notorious for really kind of like being a malcontent on any team that he was on, and Fuchs ended up trading him during his first year as a Brave. Rogers Hornsby had a few choice words for Fuchs, and in turn, Fuchs had gone to the press and told the press that Rogers Hornsby was a full member of the Ku Klux Klan, which I actually did a lot of investigating into that claim, and I found there was no evidence to support that whatsoever. And as we're at it too, I also couldn't find any evidence to suggest that Tris Speaker was a member of the Klan as well, which I think is a lot of horseshit on both accounts. So that's the kind of guy that Emil Fuchs was. He was reality TV before reality TV. The guy was just so outrageous in his statements and his actions. I have a very hard time trying to keep Emil Fuchs' statements seriously. Just, I don't find any of his stuff credible. Bob Quinn did actually purchase the Braves from, I believe, the National League. They wouldn't have Adams be the owner. He had to sell his shares, and I think he sold his shares again to the National League. I could be mistaken about that. I don't think it actually says in that article. But one of Bob Quinn's minority owners was Lou Perini, and Lou Perini is a pretty big name here in Massachusetts. Lou Perini ended up getting the Braves from Bob Quinn. I'm not sure entirely how much time Bob Quinn had with the Boston Braves, but what I do know is that with the new club now, because remember they just dissolved the old Boston Braves and formed a new club because of what happened under Fuchs. So they changed the name of the Braves to the Boston Bees, and they changed the uniforms and the colors to gold and blue. And that only lasted, I think, until Perini ended up getting the Braves back under his control. I think in about 1945 or so is when he actually purchased the team, and the Braves were transitioned back to the Braves. This is again one of the major plots in the movie The Natural, and if you guys haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's a great movie, and again, I didn't show any cards here because I don't have any cards of Babe Ruth. And I probably won't, in fact. Babe Ruth, he's such an interesting character, not just as a ball player, but as an American. And I thought that I knew everything there was to know about Babe Ruth and his career. Little did I know while I was doing the article on the 1933 Gaudy set that I was just scratching the surface of Babe Ruth and his career. A lot of what Babe Ruth's career consisted of, I think, is a lot of hearsay, a lot of rumors, a lot of newspaper print, which may not have actually been accurate. And as you can see in these articles, there are some conflicting reports about what Babe Ruth had actually stated. I also think that this is a very poignant story too to what's going on today because we have a lot of legalized gambling in sports, a lot of college, I guess, gambling going on, and this doesn't really affect me per se because I don't gamble, and I collect vintage. However, now that we have like DraftKings and legalized college gambling and legalized gambling on sports, so there were a lot of people who actually who didn't fare well financially on the transaction of the Boston Braves, and one of those was Bruce Wetmore, and he was a minority owner, and he said he took a $75,000 bath on the club when it had to be sold, and one of the reasons why that they had to obviously sell the team was because Charles Adams was the president of the racing association that owned Suffolk Downs, and he was an owner of Suffolk Downs too. So they didn't want any connection between horse racing and the baseball and the Braves. So he was forced to sell that team on December 31st, 1935, and it was pretty much dissolved as a company. So I think actually this has a lot to do with what's going on today, specifically because we have legalized gambling in sports now with companies like DraftKings, and the states themselves are really kind of into this. Anyway, guys, I really appreciate this. Thank you for stopping by and listening to what I have to say about this subject. I think it's absolutely fascinating.